In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a collapsible sidebar in Figma. I'll walk you through the design, the animation, how to make this fixed so that if you have content that overflows when you scroll, the sidebar stays nicely on the side. Now, a lot of this will apply to any kind of header or navigation that you're working on. If you're designing a navigation bar for maybe a mobile app, you can definitely take some of these concepts and apply it. But if you're looking specifically for maybe a hamburger menu and how to animate that, you can check out my video here. Like I said, we're going to be building every part of this from scratch with no other templates or design systems being used. If you already have some of these elements and you want to skip to specific parts of the video, you can check out those chapter markers below. Let's go ahead and create a new Figma file, and we're going to start off with the actual navigation item. So just go ahead and create a new text layer. I'll call this nav item, and I'm going to set this to 16 pixels. Hit Shift A and just duplicate that out. And I'm using two text layers here because I'm going to be using Font Awesome. So if I set this to star and change the Font Awesome font on the side, then you'll see that pop in there. Now, of course, you can use any kind of icon set. If you're using a vector SVG set, you're going to probably want to make sure you've set up those icons as components. So each icon is its own component, and then you can just slot those in using the instance swap once we create this as a component. If you are doing that, I'll show you how to do that really quickly. If, let's say, these are all of our icons here, and you wanted this to be an instance, and once you have this as a component, you would essentially select that star layer, and you'll see that we get this new triangle icon to create a component property. This is essentially just an instance swap, and then you can say set icon. Now, obviously, I only have one value here, but now when you are editing that icon, you'll see set icon is now its own dropdown, and then you can plug and play any of those icons just like that. So I'm going to undo what you just saw, and we're going to build this out using Font Awesome. So we still have our text layers here. Just rename that star to icon and then the nav item to label. And then we're going to turn this into our component. Now, once we've selected everything, this is a great way to just change all of the colors in one go. If maybe you wanted to have an icon be slightly lighter, then you could obviously click into it and you could, set that to like 50%, whatever you want to do there. It's totally up to you. Now, we're going to rename this to nav item so it's clear, and we're going to build out the hover and the selected state. So by default, we just have one component here, but once we go to the properties on the right and select variant, it's going to turn this into a component group, and we can build out as many variations as we want. So while we have the selected, select property 1, and we're going to change this to state. We'll leave that as the default state because that is what it is. And we're going to select that plus button outside of the box. That way it'll shift down nicely. And this will be our hover state with a V. And we'll have the selected state or active, whatever you want to call it. So for the hover state, I'm going to just have a simple, gray background that comes in at the top there, and we'll probably have a border radius, maybe 10 pixels or something. And then for the active state, I'm actually just going to change the color to something like a blue, like that, and paste that in for the icon. And then to prototype these is super quick. We'll hit Shift E. We're automatically in prototype mode. And we can just drag these blue circles to connect each of the variants. The first one, we're gonna have it set to while hovering. And the second one, going down to the selected state, will be on click. And then we're just gonna wanna make sure we have an on click back to the default at the top, just so you can toggle that on and off if we want to. Now, because this is gonna be a collapsible sidebar and we eventually wanna add tooltips so that in the collapse state, when you hover over an icon, you actually know what you're clicking on, we're going to create one more variant here. And so you can add that in the properties, and this is going to be collapsed. But instead of letting this value be set to default, just type in false, and that's going to make sure that this property is a toggle once we build this out. So select all of our variants here, just Alt drag, and by default, it's going to select the new property we've added because otherwise everything has the same name, and where it says false, we'll type in true. Now, there's no other prototyping needed here, but essentially we're going to just change the styling for these nav items and delete the label just like that. Now, you'll notice that when I deleted the labels that the actual size of this variant actually shrunk. So this is 36 pixels, the other one is 39. To avoid this, I'm actually going to select all of these and change it to a fixed height of, I'll actually do 48 pixels. And we're going to want to make sure that's centered to the left for the open nav items, but for the collapse state, we definitely want to have these centered just in case we have an icon that might not be the exact same width. Now regarding the icons, we're going to select that icon, and within any of these variants, if you select a layer that has that same layer name in another variant and the same hierarchy, meaning it's not inside of another folder or anything like that, you'll get this target icon that lets you select similar. We can highlight those in one go. And for this, we're going to want to make sure the height is also set to fixed, and we'll do 20 pixels, and we can center align that there. Again, that just accounts for any kind of icons that might not be that full 20 pixels. If you add something more narrow, it's still going to line up nicely on the icons, but then we're not messing up the labels to the right every time we change out an icon. Now, the next thing we want to do is make all of these elements editable really quickly. So if we select the nav item, use that select similar option, go over to the content here on the right, and this will be label. So this is going to let us override that label from the properties panel when we're editing the instance. And we're actually going to do the same thing for the icon because we're using a font for the icon that helps with this step here. Again, if you're doing instance swap, you can set that out like I showed you at the beginning. Now, the last thing we have to do here is just add the tooltip for the collapsed hover state. Again, we don't really need this for the open state because the labels are right there, but when you're just looking at an icon, we want to make sure that we can actually see what we're clicking on. So just go ahead and paste in that label here. And for this, we're going to keep that content label linked because we want this to be able to update depending on whatever you enter the first time. That'll make more sense down the road, but just leave everything as it is here. At the top right, make sure you hit absolute positioning. So this is actually going to push the layer outside of the icon, and essentially it's telling the component to ignore this layer. But because it's set within the component, we can still leverage constraints to make sure it's kind of pinned to that layer. So right now it's set to left and center. If I set this to center for the vertical here, that'll make sure that if for some reason this got really tall, you'll see that that's reacting and automatically fitting. So you're not really throwing it outside the component. It's still part of the component. It's just not going to offset any of those existing elements. So leave it set to left and center. And if you want to style this, you can, maybe add like a dark gray styling here just so it's clear what you're clicking on. Maybe round that out a little bit. And I'm actually going to shift this just a little bit more. You want to use the arrow keys probably for this just so you don't click and drag it outside the component. If you wanted it overlapping or maybe slightly apart, you can totally do that. I'm going to leave it like this. And we can quickly test this out by just creating a frame and dragging one of these guys in here. And we'll have actually two separate ones, one for the collapse so we can see what's happening there. So if we look at our nav item, when we hover over, we get this nice little effect. When I click onto it, we're activating that active state. And when I hover over the nav item with the icon, you see that that pops in here. I don't love that it's super snappy. If that's what you're going for, that's great. I'm just going to change in the prototype mode. We can select all of these. And for all the interactions here, you can select the animation from instant to dissolve. I think that'll just add a nice little layer. So if we take a look now, we've got a nice little fade, and same with that tooltip as well. If you wanted the tooltip to maybe come in after a few seconds, you could set up an after delay animation. I'm just gonna roll with this as is. I think this looks fine, and we can go and actually start building the sidebar. So let's just alt drag one of these items out here, hit Shift A, and we can just duplicate this. I'm gonna have maybe 5 items. Then we're gonna have that secondary navigation and then the collapsible button, which is basically just a trigger to change from collapsed to expanded. So we can actually duplicate all of those. I'm gonna break it down section by section. So we have 5 items at the top for primary navigation. And then I'm gonna put this kind of invisible spacer here. For this, you're gonna wanna make sure the fill is actually off so that it's not necessarily visible, but it is offsetting certain content like we want, because we want a little bit of a gap there. And then for the height, I'm just gonna have 16 pixels here. And then we'll duplicate out that last item and hit Command right bracket if you're on a Mac. and that'll shift it down with auto layout. And we'll have 2 items here. I'll actually do another spacer, which I'll just rename that rectangle. We'll duplicate that out and push it down to the bottom. And then lastly, we'll have the nav item for the trigger, like I said. So let's just work in reverse order and let's start to relabel some of these. So for the nav item, this will be trigger. You could have it be expandable or collapsible, as long as it's something unique and doesn't look like the others. And then for the remaining items, we can actually just hold Shift and Command to select all of those items in one go. We're gonna hit Command R, and here we actually can rename all these layers in bulk. So we can just actually click this button, current name, and I'm gonna want a space and then a number here. Now you can have this be ascending or descending. You can have it start at a certain point if you want. So I'll let you play around with it. But essentially, once we do that, it'll rename all of the items ascending 1 through 7 or however many you have. It's really important to actually keep unique names when you're doing prototyped interactions, because Figma can get a little buggy once you start hovering over, and it can sometimes forget which one to look for. I'm not going to give the best explanation for unique names, but I can tell you that whenever you're getting into nested interactions like this, it's a definite must. So let's go ahead and select this main frame 2, which we can rename sidebar now. Let's set the height to fixed and then just hit enter. And if you just hit this once, it'll select all of the layers down a level, and we can change these to a fill container option. So because we're using auto layout, now when I click and drag, you can see everything is actually filling the space there if I hover over it. That's exactly what we want, because we're actually going to use a fixed width. And I'll use about like 250 pixels for the expanded state. And now we can right click and create a component out of this. And we'll actually go over to properties and select variant. And for property 1, just say collapsed. And for default, we're actually going to set this to false, and then the collapse version to true. And again, that just lets us enable a Boolean property, which is a fancy way of saying a toggle. So now that we've added that other variant, we'll just say true. And one thing I like to do for something like this, where there's just 2 variations, is actually put auto layout on the main component group and then just change that order. And this is just really helpful because you're seeing things side by side, and that's just a quick way to do it without dragging it around every single time. For the collapse state, we're going to want to make sure all of these nav items here, including the trigger, are set to the collapsed. Hopefully that's pretty self-explanatory. And then the width, we can do something like 80 pixels. You could do 60, 75. I'll actually go with like 75 should be good. And then we just need to connect these 2 states. So hit Shift E. We're going to click the left here and make sure you click into the trigger, because we only want this to be activated when we click expand or collapse. We don't obviously want to be clicking on random items and then the whole thing is shifting around. So click and drag from that trigger over to the entire variation for collapsed, and then do that in reverse, where you select just the icon for expand and drag that over to the expanded state. And when you do this, Figma is smart enough to know whenever you're prototyping within a component that you're linking variations. And so what it does is it actually adds this change to property to the animation, and that solves a lot of the grunt work. And then within the animation, typically for something like this, you want to make sure everything is set to Smart Animate. What Smart Animate allows you to do is basically give Figma the heads up to look for any layers that are named the same. And then if you have something like a hamburger menu and you want it to animate to a collapsed or an X or whatever, it'll do that for you without you having to keyframe everything, just because you have the same layer names. So that's kind of my default for something like this when we have this many instances and similar properties. So the last thing I'm going to do is just change the label here from nav item to collapse, just so we know what we're clicking on. And let's just go ahead and test what we have here. So let's build a new frame, jump into prototype mode. And if we collapse this, this should shrink. And immediately you'll actually see that all those tooltips are coming right in automatically. So we didn't name anything, but you'll see collapse has already been updated, and I didn't have to do that manually. And that's because we linked that label property, that text property, within the nav item component. So just to give you a refresh, if we jump back here, when we set these labels up, we created this label property in the content section, and then we use that same property for the tooltip so that automatically whatever you put in that label, it's going to update for you inside the prototype. So I'm going to just really quickly style this a little bit. For the icons, we'll add some, different ones here. We'll do like boxes, we'll do products, stuff like that. So now that we've added content, I'm going to jump in here, and I did make a mistake, but I'll show you how to fix it. When we hit collapse, you'll see that everything else is working. We've got our tooltips, everything's looking nice, but the arrow is not updating. And so the main reason for this, going back to the unique names within prototype mode, is that you don't want these to both be called trigger. So ignore everything else I said, but if we change this to collapse and then the other one to expand, as long as they're unique, now when we jump back in, you'll see that that icon is very snappy and will update immediately. So I just want to show you how that can happen. That can be pretty buggy if you don't have those unique names, but other than that, everything is working pretty nicely. Now the last little bit of this is to pair this up with some actual content and show how you can use auto layout to dynamically shift stuff around. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the content. I'm going to assume you have something that you're testing. I'll just throw in a dashboard here, and I'm intentionally adding a lot of blocks here. Now that we have some dummy content, what we're going to do is select all the actual body part of this and wrap this in another auto layout. And we're going to call this body or container, whatever makes sense to you. And make sure that the height we can set to fixed for now, and we'll hit enter and make sure everything is set to fill. And we'll just keep hitting enter because each time we do that, you'll see it opens up the next nested layer. We'll just keep hitting fill there to make sure that this is dynamic. So if we just test this out on the body, if we click and drag, everything is resizing nicely. So the first thing we're going to do is change our main canvas to auto layout. So we'll just add auto layout here. It's going to look really messy for a minute, but generally when you're working on these canvases, you usually know what you're designing for. So if we're doing this for desktop, this would be 1440. And I'm going to set that height to about 1080 and make sure it's aligned to the top left. So I'm going to actually ignore or maybe add like 32 pixels of padding on the side or margin, so we have those gutters. And then on the top, if you're not doing a header or any kind of navigation, you could also set this to 32, whatever makes sense to you. And we don't need to do anything on the bottom. Now the next little bit is to actually set the body here from fixed into fill. And now if we take a look, just before we jump into prototype mode, if we take a look at when we switch this to collapsed, automatically you're seeing this snapping around really nicely because we're just basically telling this main section to fill whatever space is not here. So if we completely hid the sidebar, it would take up 100%. Because we have this set to a fixed width for the sidebar, we can kind of define what that margin is. If you want to add some spacing, you could do that here, maybe add 25 pixels, 32 pixels, whatever makes sense. And the last thing I want to fix is to push this container for the sidebar all the way down to fill the space. If we do that, you'll see that collapse is still sitting there. And there's a really easy way to fix this. If we go into our spacer, that bottom spacer here, and we just select that to fill container, it's automatically going to push that sidebar down. And essentially, we've created our dynamic layout. If we jump into prototype mode and we scale out here, as soon as I hit collapse, we can see that quickly showing up here. Now you may notice that the tooltips are being cut off. A very easy fix. Because we're using auto layout, there's a feature called stacking within auto layout. So if you just go to your main frame here, the main artboard, whatever you're working on, go into the advanced auto layout settings and change canvas stacking to first on top. So essentially it just looks at the order because sidebar is first in that structure here, then it'll prioritize the tooltips to go over whatever content you put within the body container. Now the last step we have here is just to make the content on the right scrollable. You'll remember I created a lot of different variations and this is going off the page. So the way to fix this is to select your body layer and change it from hug to fill. What this essentially does is it will contain it within the canvas you have. So again, it's really important to have a fixed height and width for your main canvas, but generally that's the case anyway. When you're designing for mobile or tablet or whatever, you're setting those parameters up front. And the reason you set it to fill is so that essentially you have content overflowing outside that container. So now Figma knows that there's stuff beneath this, but it's forcing it to be contained visually within this layer. And we're not cutting that off. So if we go now to prototype mode and we make sure body selected, we can change this from overflow no scrolling to vertical. So now if we test that out, you'll see that this whole section on the right is scrollable, but we want that sidebar to stay fixed to the left. Now there's a lot of other properties you can mess around with if you want it to be sticky, if you want it to add a header and have that overlaid on top too. I'll probably cover that in some other videos, but that's the basic functionality that we're going for. Hopefully that video was helpful. Give it a like and subscribe for more videos like this. It really helps me out, and I'll see you in the next one.